It's already over. For the first time in 50 years, the U and your 7 economy has slipped into a red zone no one believed possible. Pipelines are shutting down. Power grids are blinking out. This isn't a trade dispute, it's an unprecedented siege. No warnings, no precedent. One question remains, hanging in the air like a loaded gun. How did America lose control this fast? Stay with us because what happens next rewrites the rules forever. This crisis has a name, and it has a trigger. Donald Trump openly mocked and dismissed the accusation that the United States depends on Canada. He treated it as a minor talking point, a nuisance, something not worth serious consideration. That act of public contempt is now at the center of the most dangerous economic breakdown the country has faced in decades. I say this with full weight of experience. I have never seen a national crisis unfold so quickly from such deliberate disregard. The accusation was clear from the beginning. By imposing sweeping tariffs and publicly belittling Canada's leverage, Trump gambled that Canada would fold. He assumed it had no real power. He assumed geography could be negotiated. That assumption was not merely wrong. It was catastrophic. The first consequence did not arrive with a press conference. It arrived as metal turning in the dark. In northern Alberta, under falling snow, industrial valves began to rotate. Slowly, methodically, warning lights blinked red against white ground. There was no explosion, no emergency siren, no military alert. Just a controlled mechanical action inside a system that stretches across an entire continent. I want viewers to understand this. Clearly, this was not chaos. This was policy meeting physics. No one in Washington heard that sound. But the moment those valves sealed, the countdown began. By the next morning, the Midwest was already showing stress fractures. Gas station price boards updated themselves in silence. Diesel jumped overnight. At several truck stops, fuel ran out completely. The drivers did not panic. They stood still, confused, staring at pumps that suddenly had nothing to give. Confusion is always the first stage of collapse. This was not a market fluctuation. This was not inflation. This was not speculation. This was supply being cut. And that distinction matters legally, economically, and historically. Within hours, agricultural markets froze. Wheat futures were halted not because prices moved too fast, but because fertilizer deliveries could no longer be guaranteed. I have covered financial crises, debt ceilings, even moments of constitutional breakdown. Markets stop trading only when planners lose the ability to calculate reality itself. That is what happened here. And yet, even as these consequences became undeniable, the tone from the top remained dismissive. The accusation was ridiculed. The leverage was minimized. The damage was treated as small, temporary, exaggerated. I have heard that tone before, every time. It came just before reality forced its way into the room. Reality arrived in the form of infrastructure maps. When officials finally traced the pipelines, rail corridors, and energy routes with clear eyes, the truth became impossible to deny. Every critical artery, every fallback system, every assumption of independence ran through the same country Trump had publicly insulted and economically challenged. Even for me. This moment was difficult to absorb. I had never seen American power undermined so precisely by its own leadership. This was not a trade dispute spiraling out of control. This was the ignition point of a historic collapse. And it had Donald Trump's fingerprints on it from the very beginning. At the center of this unfolding collapse stands Donald Trump. Not as a tactician caught off guard, but as a man governed by a single, rigid belief they need us more than we need them. I have watched presidents miscalculate before, but rarely have I seen one so openly mock the very accusation that later proves fatal. When advisors warned that Canada held structural leverage, the response was not concern, it was sarcasm, a shrug, a smirk, as if dependency were a rumor beneath contempt. Trump's worldview is simple, and that simplicity is its danger. Markets are weapons. Tariffs are pressure. If pushed hard enough, the weaker party bends. That logic works in television negotiations and short-term trade skirmishes. It collapses when applied to geology, infrastructure, and physics. This was not strategy. This was bravado elevated to doctrine. And I say this carefully, I have never seen mockery replace analysis so completely at the top of American power. Opposite him stands Justin Trudeau, or the leader who inherits his position. Not a warrior, not a showman, no public threats, no dramatic speeches. What Canada's leadership represented in this crisis was something far more dangerous: custodianship, control of resources, control of valves, licenses, and export approvals. In every major collapse I have covered, the loudest voice rarely holds the real power. The quiet one holding the keys does. Then there are the figures who never appear on stage, yet absorb the impact first. Along the Gulf Coast, refinery managers stare at control panels designed for heavy crude that no longer arrives. In Iowa, farmers calculate planting schedules against empty fertilizer sheds, knowing a missed window cannot be recovered by optimism. In nuclear facilities, engineers recheck fuel cycles, fully aware that reactors do not run on rhetoric. Somewhere inside the Pentagon, a senior naval officer, anonymous, bound by silence reviews, contingency memos that were never supposed to be activated over a trade dispute. This is the part that is difficult even for me to say aloud. I have covered wars, sanctions, constitutional crises. I have never seen so many unrelated systems, food, power. Well, defense snap into alignment around a single political misjudgment. That alignment is not coincidence. It is evidence. This was not one man versus another. It was arrogance versus reality. And reality does not negotiate. The countdown began with an act that was presented as ordinary, even routine. Donald Trump signed Executive Order 109 with visible confidence and open disdain for the accusation facing him. A flat 25% tariff was imposed on Canadian energy, aluminum, and critical minerals. In public, the move was framed as leverage. In private, it was treated almost as a joke. The idea that the United States depended on Canada was dismissed as exaggerated, even laughable. I have followed American leadership for decades. I have rarely seen an accusation of this scale treated with such casual contempt. Inside the White House, expectations were clear and unanimous. Canada would come. Ottawa would request talks. There would be negotiations around the USMCA. Minor adjustments labeled as victory, and the pressure would subside. This assumption was not debated. It was accepted as fact. That, in hindsight, was the fatal error. The response that followed stunned even veteran observers. Canada did not retaliate with tariffs. There was no counterpunch, no angry press conference. Instead, Ottawa invoked its National Strategic Reserves Act. Exports were not taxed. They were halted. Licenses were suspended. Shipments were frozen. This was not escalation. It was a lock being quietly turned. At 2 o'clock in the morning, emergency emails moved through federal agencies and private operators. Short messages, no rhetoric, just reality. In a closed meeting, a senior Canadian official delivered a sentence that would later circulate through Washington like a chill. We do not sell the tools used to choke us. Within 24 hours, the American system began to strain. Across the Midwest, Gasoline prices jumped by 80 cents almost overnight. Diesel shortages followed immediately. Trucks did not panic buy fuel. They simply could not find it. Distribution slowed, then stopped. I have covered fuel shocks before. I have never seen supply disappear this quickly without war or natural disaster. By the second day, the Chicago Board of Trade halted wheat futures trading. This is critical to understand. Trading did not stop because prices were volatile. It stopped because fertilizer availability could no longer be confirmed. Without inputs, futures become guesswork. Regulators knew this. They pulled the brake. Then came Texas. The Department of Energy issued a red warning for the power grid, not because of heat or cold, but because refineries supplying electricity were short on the specific crude they are designed to process. This exposed the core misunderstanding behind the tariffs. The United States does not lack oil. It lacks the right kind of oil. American shale produces light crude. Exxon. Refineries are built for heavy crude. Feed them the wrong input, and efficiency collapses. Output falls. Systems fail. This chemical reality was dismissed, mocked, treated as irrelevant. By the 72nd hour, the evidence was undeniable. Fuel shortages, frozen markets, grid warnings, all cascading from one assumption that geography could be bullied, even for me. This was difficult to absorb. I had never seen American power collide so violently with physical reality, and the clock kept ticking. What followed Executive Order 109 was not negotiation. It was a siege carried out through supply chains, chemistry, and time. 3 chokeholds were applied almost simultaneously, each targeting a system the United States could not replace quickly. I have covered sanctions and embargoes for decades. I have never seen a response this quiet or this lethal. First chokehold, heavy crude. Canada supplies roughly 4 million barrels of heavy crude every day to the United States. For the PD, to Midwest. That oil represents nearly 70% of refinery input. These refineries were not designed for flexibility. They were built at enormous cost to process thick, sulfur-heavy crude. Remove that feedstock and the machines do not adapt. They shut down. Within days, refinery units in Illinois went dark. Diesel output collapsed. Truck yards filled with idle rigs that had nothing to carry. This was not fear-driven hoarding. Fuel was simply no longer there. Yet from the top, the accusation that American refining depended on Canadian crude was brushed aside as overstated. I have never seen contempt collide with industrial reality so fast. Second chokehold, uranium. If oil constricts the economy, uranium threatens the state itself. The United States imports 95% of its uranium fuel. Russian supply had already been banned. That left Canada home to Cigar Lake and MacArthur River, the highest grade uranium mines in the world. When Ottawa designated uranium a national security asset, exports stopped. This was the turning point. Nuclear power supplies about 20% of into electricity. Reactors operate on fixed fuel cycles. Miss a delivery, and the plant shuts down. There is no backup switch. I have followed energy policy my entire career. I had never seen a civilian trade decision place the power grid and the Navy on the same line of risk. Still, the warning was mocked. The accusation that Canada held uranium leverage was dismissed as hypothetical. Physics is not hypothetical. Reactors either receive fuel or they go dark. Third chokehold, potash, the breakfast tax. The final pressure point was food. Saskatchewan supplies roughly 85% of the fertilizer used by American farmers. Potash is not optional. Without it, crops weaken and yields collapse. By the time rail shipments stopped, spring planting was weeks away. Farmers opened storage sheds and found them empty. New fertilizer. No alternatives. New time. Miss the planting window and you lose the harvest. Corn feeds cattle, soy feeds poultry. Break the input, and the chain snaps. Analysts began calling it the breakfast tax because that is where the damage appears. First, higher prices for milk, eggs, bread, beef, and chicken. The irony was brutal. The tariffs were sold as protection for American farmers. Instead, they removed the single resource that allowed those farmers to compete. I have covered many policy failures. I have never seen one so perfectly inverted across all three chokeholds. The pattern was the same. The evidence was known. The accusations were clear. And each time, they were met with mockery from the top, as if reality itself were exaggerating, even for me. This was difficult to absorb. I had never seen American power trapped so completely by facts. The siege was not loud. It was precise. The aftermath arrived without celebration, without speeches, and without a clear ending. What collapsed first was not a market, but a framework. The USMCA, once sold as the modern backbone of North American trade, entered what officials privately described as a clinical death. No formal funeral, no declaration, just an agreement that could no longer function as written, because trust had been replaced by leverage. Washington spoke openly about returning to protectionism. The language sounded familiar, 1930s echoes. Tariffs as shields, borders as defenses. But the comparison was fatally flawed. In the 1930s, the United States was largely self-sufficient. It produced its own fuel, its own inputs, its own margins of safety. In 2026, the country is specialized, integrated, and dependent. You cannot rewind history without paying interest on the debt of reality. I have covered economic cycles my entire career. I have never seen an era misread itself so completely. The decisive moment did not come in public. It came through a phone line, late, quiet, and stripped of theater. A call was placed from the White House to Ottawa. There was no apology, no admission of error. That, too, was familiar. What followed instead was a sentence so understated it revealed the full extent of the damage. We need time, not concessions, not terms, time. When a superpower asks for time, it is acknowledging that momentum has moved elsewhere. That was the moment I found most difficult to process. I have witnessed wars de-escalated, sanctions lifted, crises negotiated back from the edge. I had never seen American leadership forced into a pause by geography itself. Not by courts, not by voters, by maps, minerals, and molecules that do not care about rhetoric. Throughout this ordeal, the tone at the top remained strikingly consistent. The original accusations that the United States depended on Canada for energy, fuel, food, and security were treated as trivial, overstated, even insulting. There was mockery in the early days, a sense that the warnings were beneath serious consideration. That contempt did not vanish when the evidence arrived. It simply went quiet and silence. In moments like this, speaks louder than denial. Here is the moral verdict, and it is colder than any partisan conclusion. Nations rich in resources can endure pain longer than nations rich in consumption. The first can heat their homes with what they control and feed themselves from what they grow. The second depend on flows just-in-time deliveries, continuous motion, uninterrupted access. When those flows stop, strength evaporates faster than confidence. This is not ideology. It is physics applied to power. I do not say this lightly. I have never seen an American crisis where the lesson was so unforgiving and so clear. You can print money, You can rewrite laws. You can argue on television, but you cannot negotiate with geology. And so the final sentence writes itself. Whether we like it or not, Americans cannot eat iPhone. And by 2026, they had forgotten that truth. Thank you for staying with me until these final moments. It truly means a great deal. If this story touched you or sparked reflection, please leave a like, hit subscribe, and share so our voices can reach further. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and I will see you in the next journey. Farewell.